Control your damn dog or get out of my courtroom. Judge Melrose's words cut through the room like a blade. The courtroom was already tense from the moment the trial began, but now, with that dog barking uncontrollably at the back of the gallery, the tension turned to annoyance. A few officers chuckled under their breath, trying to hide their smirks. One leaned over to the other and whispered, "Maybe he wants to testify." The laughter spread, but the man holding the leash didn't smile. He didn't even flinch. He just tightened his grip on the trembling harness and whispered something under his breath to the dog. A German shepherd with a graying snout, a scar across one eye, and a voice that refused to be ignored. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Callan, this isn't a circus. What is this dog doing here?" Callan rose from the bench slowly, the weight of exhaustion in his shoulders. His uniform, though neatly pressed, looked lived in, worn, like him. "Your Honor, I'm sorry," he said, "but Jax doesn't bark like this. He never has. Not without reason." "Oh, for God's sake," the prosecutor muttered. "We're postponing a murder trial over a barking mutt?" Callan's gaze was steady, unmoving. "I'm telling you, something's wrong," the courtroom scoffed. The bailiff took a step forward, motioning for Callan to sit. That's when Jax yanked hard on the leash. Not toward the door, not toward any person, toward the corner of the room, toward the old wooden supply closet no one had opened in years. Jax barked again, then began to scratch the base of the door, with a kind of desperation that made the room fall eerily silent. The judge stood up. "What's he doing?" Callan was already moving. He handed off the leash to the bailiff and approached the closet, slowly. "I don't know," he said, "but I think we need to find out." One of the court officers stepped in, using a spare key to pop the old lock. The door creaked open, revealing what looked like a dusty stack of mop buckets, paint cans, and forgotten supplies. Jax lunged forward, whining now, pawing his way into the shadows behind the shelves. "What the hell?" someone started to say, but then the smell hit them. It was faint at first, sour, sharp, then unmistakable. Decay. Jax let out a low, haunting whine and nudged his nose under a rolled-up tarp. Callan knelt down beside him, peeling back the edge of the canvas. And there, tucked into the corner, were 5 tiny bodies, kittens, motionless, damp fur clinging to thin, fragile bones. It was impossible to tell how long they'd been there, but it hadn't been long enough for the warmth to fully leave them. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The laughter was gone. One woman covered her mouth and turned away. Another officer whispered a curse under his breath. The judge stood frozen. Who put them there?" Callan's face was pale now. His fingers trembled as he gently reached for the nearest one. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but someone wanted them forgotten." The prosecutor took a step back, visibly shaken. This can't be connected to the case, can it?" Callan turned to face him, his voice colder than it had been all day. "You're prosecuting a man for a string of break-ins at local vet clinics, but what you don't know is that those clinics were all animal shelters, and every time something went missing, something else disappeared too." He looked back at the kittens, his throat tightening. "I think this is the piece we've been missing." The judge slowly lowered himself back into his chair, stunned. "We need to call animal control, secure the evidence, and God help whoever's responsible." And in the center of it all, Jack sat quietly now, his head lowered near the tiniest kitten, refusing to move, because he hadn't just been barking for attention. He had been barking for the truth. The supply closet had been sealed off, but the smell lingered in the courtroom long after the door was shut. It clung to the wooden floors, the heavy drapes, even the people, like sorrow made visible. No one spoke for several minutes. The judge stared at his empty glass of water. The prosecutor shuffled papers just to keep his hands from trembling. Even the bailiff had to leave the room, visibly shaken. But Callan stayed kneeling near the doorway, one hand resting on Jax's back, his other still hovering where the kittens had been moments ago. His eyes weren't red, but they were empty, in a way that only came from years of carrying things no one else wanted to hold. Animal control had arrived quickly, but their faces had all carried the same disbelief. 5 kittens, abandoned and left to die in the courthouse closet. No tags, no note, just silence and the sound of a dog's breath waiting to be heard. Jax didn't wag his tail. He didn't celebrate. He just watched every pair of hands that touched the tarp, making sure no one forgot what had been hidden there. When the room was cleared again, Judge Melrose requested the courtroom be sealed for a recess. He ordered that all surveillance tapes be reviewed. Then, slowly, He motioned for Callan to approach the bench. The courtroom had gone from a place of judgment to a place of reckoning, and Callan was the only one who hadn't flinched. The judge leaned forward. "I need to ask, officer, do you believe this was planted?" Callan's answer was immediate. "No, sir. I think it was hidden." "By whom?" "I'm not sure yet," he replied, "but I have my suspicions." Melrose exhaled, staring down at the scattered folders on his bench. "Then we'll reopen the archive rooms and evidence logs. You'll have full access to the lower levels. I want every hallway reviewed, every janitorial record. Whoever did this didn't just dump animals. They buried something." That night, Callan didn't go home. He stayed in the basement of the courthouse, armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a clipboard, and Jax's instincts. The old brick hallways were cold, the kind that chilled your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Most people didn't even know there was a boiler room beneath the east wing. Fewer still had reason to walk past the rusted metal door marked "Facilities Only," but Jax pulled hard toward it, nose twitching, ears low. Inside, the room smelled like bleach and dust. Filing boxes lined the far wall, each one labeled with old evidence tags and brittle masking tape. But one box was different. It was newer, cleaner, out of place. Callan pulled it down and opened it slowly. At first, it looked like nothing, just shredded paper and a folded pair of latex gloves. But beneath the padding, something colder waited. A memory card, small, labeled with a date and no case number. He slipped it into his phone, and within seconds, the video began. The screen flickered before revealing a dimly lit hallway, one that looked painfully familiar. The frame shook as if filmed by someone hiding. In the footage, a man in a janitor's uniform entered carrying a box. Not a cleaning cart, not a mop. A box with holes punched in the side. He looked both ways, then disappeared into the courtroom with it. The timestamp matched the day before the kittens were found. Jax whined softly, almost like he recognized something, or someone. Callan rewound the video, pausing on the man's face as he glanced at the camera for half a second. The angle was poor, but it was enough. Not a janitor, a retired officer, one who had vanished from public service after an internal affairs investigation 3 years ago. Richard Ames. Callan stood there for a long time, processing what he'd just uncovered. Ames had been bitter when he left, accused of mishandling evidence during a cruelty case that was quietly dismissed. No charges, no press, just silence. And now here he was, slipping into a courtroom with a box full of dying kittens under the guise of a maintenance worker. The next morning, Callan returned to court with the footage. The judge watched in silence, not even blinking as the image froze on Ames's face. "Why?" Melrose whispered when the screen went black. "I don't know," Callan replied. "But I think he wanted to make a statement. He knew we were getting close. Maybe he knew Jax would be there. Do you think the kittens were left as a threat? A message?" Callan nodded slowly. "Not just to the system, to me. Jax was the dog that exposed his first case. He blamed us. This was personal." The judge sat back, weary. "Then find him, and when you do, bring him to this courtroom." Callan didn't promise anything. He just gave Jax a gentle tap on the shoulder, and together they walked back into the world, chasing down the trail of a man who thought his crimes could be buried under the weight of time and silence. But what he didn't count on was a dog that never forgot, and a truth that refused to stay hidden. The snowfall had thickened by the time Callan reached the old train depot on the edge of town. It had been decommissioned for over a decade, the tracks rusting into the earth, the building now little more than a shelter for wind and the forgotten. But Jax had led him here with unmistakable certainty, pulling hard against the leash once they crossed the fence. Callan had learned long ago not to question the dog's instincts. What Jax knew couldn't be taught. What he sensed couldn't be ignored. The tip had come from a courthouse janitor, a man with trembling hands and a conscience that had finally cracked. "I never knew about the kittens," he'd whispered, eyes fixed on the floor. "But I saw Ames. He used my uniform. Said he was following up on an inspection. Said I owed him for covering my DUI last year. I didn't think—" Callan hadn't needed him to finish. He'd already known Ames didn't act alone. Now, standing in front of the shattered depot windows, Callan could feel the shift in the air. The place wasn't empty. Something lingered inside. Shadows of violence, the scent of something foul and stale. Jax growled low in his throat and pawed at the door, the muscles along his back rippling with tension. "Easy, boy," Callan murmured, drawing his flashlight and unholstering the pistol from his hip. He pushed the door open, The inside was colder than outside. The walls wept condensation, the floor littered with broken glass and rotting crates. In the far corner, a flickering lantern cast weak light over what looked like a mattress and a pile of old clothes. Callan stepped forward, his boots crunching over gravel and debris. Then he heard it. Movement. Subtle. Too controlled to be an animal. "Richard Ames," Callan called out, voice firm. "You're surrounded. Come out with your—" "Hands where I can see them." Silence followed. Jax inched forward, teeth bared, then a low, mocking laugh echoed from the shadows. "You brought the mutt," the voice rasped. "Of course you did." Ames stepped into the light slowly, hands raised, but his eyes burned with something feral. He looked thinner than before, unshaven and unwell, like guilt had hollowed him out from the inside. Callan didn't lower his weapon. "You planted that box in my courtroom." "Planted?" Ames sneered. "No, I placed it. There's a difference. You people buried the truth for years. I just uncovered it. I made you look, made you care. By killing them?" Callan's voice cracked with restrained fury. "By suffocating 5 defenseless kittens in a supply closet like trash?" "They weren't supposed to die," Ames said. "They were bait, a wake-up call. I knew you'd find them. I knew the dog would sense them. That's what they do, right? Heroes. So go ahead. Take your win. Lock me up." Callan didn't move. He just stared at the man who had once worn the same badge. "This isn't about justice to you. It never was. It's about revenge." Ames laughed again, shaking his head. "You still don't get it. I was trying to make people feel something. For once. Do you know how many times I filed reports on cruelty cases that no one read? How many times I saw evidence tossed out because the paperwork was inconvenient? That's not an excuse," Callan said. "You don't get to make yourself a fee. Martyr by playing God with innocent lives." "I didn't kill them," Ames hissed. "Neglect did. Indifference did. I just put them where someone would finally listen." Jax let out a low growl, stepping between the two men. Callan placed a calming hand on his back, but his eyes never left Ames. "You're coming with me," he said quietly. "And you're going to answer for every second those animals suffered. Not in the press, not in a viral headline. In court, in front of the people who still believe in truth." Ames didn't resist as Callan cuffed him, but as he was led out of the building, he looked back at Jax one last time. "Funny, isn't it? All that barking. And in the end, he's the only one who ever saw me." Callan didn't respond. He just tightened his grip and walked forward into the snow. Later, as they returned to the courthouse, Judge Melrose waited, with a statement in his hands and the media circling like wolves outside. Callan didn't speak to the press. He handed over the footage, the evidence logs, the full report. Then, without a word, he walked through the side door with Jax close behind. Inside his office, he sat heavily, the exhaustion finally catching up. Jax lay down beside his chair, resting his head on Callan's boot. "You knew," Callan whispered. "From the first bark, you knew they were there." Jax didn't react. He didn't need to. The silence said enough, because in the end, it wasn't the badge that cracked the case. It wasn't the law, the rules, or the system. It was a dog who refused to be ignored, and 5 tiny souls who mattered more than anyone ever thought they would. The courthouse was quieter than usual the next morning, but the air was different, thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves knew the truth that had finally been dragged into the light. Richard Ames had been booked just before dawn. The footage recovered from the depot, along with the contents of the memory card Callan found in the supply closet, had been enough to spark a full investigation into a string of suppressed cruelty reports dating back nearly a decade. But none of that made the weight any easier to carry. Callan sat alone in the conference room, reviewing statements with tired eyes. He had barely slept. Each report felt like another cut across the conscience. Photos of abused animals, notes flagged, but never followed up, documents signed by names he once trusted. And yet, nothing haunted him more than the image of those 5 kittens, curled together in their last moments, as if huddling could save them from what humans had done. Jax lay under the table beside him, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his breath. He hadn't barked once since the arrest, as if he too was grieving. A knock interrupted the silence. Judge Melrose stepped in, coat draped over one arm, eyes darker than usual. He didn't speak right away, just nodded at Jax, then sat across from Callan with the kind of weariness that didn't come from age, but from disappointment. "There's something you should see," the judge said, placing a manila folder on the table. It was sent anonymously, to my office this morning. No return address, no fingerprints. Callan opened the folder and froze. Inside were copies of intake sheets from the county shelter, dated 6 months prior, each one stamped with a denial of treatment for kittens, brought in after hours. All 5 names on the sheets matched the ID numbers from the microchips scanned in the courtroom discovery. These weren't just strays. They had been surrendered, registered, logged, and turned away. Callan swallowed hard. This wasn't Ames? Melrose shook his head. He used their story, but he didn't create it. Those kittens were left out, in the cold by the very people meant to protect them. Ames found out and used them, twisted it into his sick little performance. But the negligence started before he ever touched that box. So we were already failing them, Callan said, softly. Melrose leaned back in his chair. Which means we're not just prosecuting one man. We're holding a system accountable. The words hung in the air like a verdict. That afternoon, during a special session, Callan took the stand, not as a witness to a crime, but as a man who had seen what most refused to look at. He told the room about Jax's first bark, the courtroom's laughter, the unraveling that followed. He spoke not with drama, but with quiet conviction, each sentence landing like a stone in still water. When he paused, you could hear hearts breaking. The dog didn't bark to make noise, Callan said at the end. He barked because someone needed to listen, not just to him, but to the lives we're supposed to protect. Because if we don't... Listen, they die quietly, in boxes, in closets, in systems that move too slowly or not at all. When he stepped down, the room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The silence was enough. Later that evening, Callan visited the shelter. Not the one from the reports, but a small non-profit in the West End, run by 2 women who took in every creature they could with whatever scraps they had. When he arrived, one of them led him to a small heated enclosure in the back. Inside were 5 tiny kittens, rescued from another case just days before. He knelt beside them and felt something shift in his chest. One of the kittens, a calico with a limp in her hind leg, climbed onto his boot and mewed softly. Jack sat behind him, tail wagging faintly, ears perked. Callan smiled for the first time in days. We can't save them all, he said quietly, but maybe we can save these. The woman beside him nodded, and that matters. Before he left, Callan filled out the paperwork. He didn't adopt all 5, but the calico with the limp, she went home with him that night. Jack sat beside her in the passenger seat like he had known she was theirs all along, and as they drove through the dark streets, the weight didn't disappear, but it softened, because for every voice silenced, there were still some who would bark, still some who would listen, and still a few lives left to save. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was quiet once again, but this time it wasn't heavy with tension or denial. It felt reverent, like something sacred had passed through and left behind the faint echo of truth. Judge Melrose sat at the bench, his gavel resting untouched. Across the room, the same spot where Jax once barked at the forgotten box was now marked by a small brass plaque in memory of the 5. Simple, honest, and deserved. Callan stood near the back, not in uniform, not testifying, just present. Jack sat beside him, calmer than ever, his eyes half closed but alert. On his collar now hung a small silver tag, etched with 5 names, each one recovered from the shelter's lost intake logs. Their short lives had been invisible to most, but they would not be forgotten. The judge's voice broke the silence. Today, this court closes a chapter that should have never been written, but because of one dog's cry, and one man who refused to look away, we have changed the way this city responds to animal cruelty, and maybe how it listens to those who have no voice. Applause didn't follow, only nods, only tears. The kind that meant something had landed in people's hearts, where words often fail to reach. Outside, the snow had melted into slush. Spring was starting to push against the frost. As Callan walked out with Jax, the wind carried the scent of thawed earth and new beginnings. He paused at the bottom of the steps, looking toward the park across the street. A girl stood there, maybe 7 or 8 years old, cradling a kitten in her arms. It looked fragile, but safe, alive. She waved at Jax. He wagged his tail, just once. Callan smiled and whispered, "Good work, partner." They turned toward home, the sun breaking gently through the clouds above, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world had listened.